Okay, so maybe I will start because we have just 1 hour and plenty of discussion to share and plenty of great examples from our panelists. Hello, everybody. Sorry to be far away once again, but happy to exchange with all of you. Today, we continue on the subject of impact and outcome measurement and management. Maybe some of you have just discussed and shared the presentations on the financial service providers perspective, moderated by Amelia Greenberg from SPTF. And we will continue with this session on the investors' perspective. I'm very happy to moderate this session with Rachel Bass from the GIN Global Impact Investing Network, with Safeya Zaitoun from Tameo, a spin-off from Symbiotics on impact measurement, and Juan Luis Podesta from Triple Jump Technical Assistance. And we will share with you some experience and how the investors envision outcome measurement. This session is also a follow-up on plenty of discussion that we already had in the last 2 years so I'm trying to change, on the last 2 years with investors, and in particular the Investor Action Group of the European Microfinance Platform. We had a session last year. We had some working groups, exchanges with some of you in the panel, some of you in the assistance, I guess. And just for your information, e-MFP has just produced a working document that we work with SPTF, Ceres, and e-MFP Action Group, Investor Action Group, on outcome measurement and standard indicators for the financial inclusion aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And just as an introduction to our session, I would just like to share some of the discussion we had and why we think and investors think it's a good moment to really work on outcomes measurement. That's linked to recent trends that we see in the market with a growing demand for accountability. Its impact investment is a growing sector, but we need more robust, meaningful evidence of social change. So impact investor and the financial service provider who describe themselves as social need some data to have credibility and funding sources. So there is really a need to show how impact investors are impact investors. But on the other hand, it's also getting easier and cheaper to get access to data. The technology has enabled electronic collection and storage of data, leading to much richer and more powerful opportunities. And this was discussed also just on the previous session on the financial service provider perspective with 4G, for example, and Finca collecting data on an electronic way and having capacities to analyze and collect and providing meaningful dashboards. We also have adjusted our expectation on what financial inclusion can really achieve. We are not necessarily trying to prove that clients are getting out of poverty, for example, or really being totally empowered, but with outcome data, financial service provider can verify the financial health of their clients, and investor can verify that their social objectives are being achieved also by their investees. So we collect now, when we talk about outcomes management and measurement, more short-term data which are actionable for the financial service provider and the investors. The SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, have also emerged as a common framework. We see some studies from the GIN showing the great interest by the investors on setting impact goals, reporting on impact, a little bit more challenging on collecting data on impact, but that can be an interesting framework for aligning also expectations of the investors and the investees. So we see investor interest growing in terms of outcome measurement, and this European Microfinance Week is one of the vision on this, because we have plenty of session from FMO, from this session, from the FSP perspective, from the regulation on the willingness to measure outcome, even if it is still challenging. And even if it is not yet a priority for most of the FSP, specifically if we are talking about impact, and FSP thinks it's too far away from what they can do, too costly. So the issue is also to guide FSP on short-term, continuous, and actionable data collection. So we had this discussion with the FSP previously. Let's talk now on the investor perspective. And I will pass the floor first to Rachel to present us the work done and the perspective from the Global Impact Investing Network. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cecile, and thank you to everyone on the line. It's really great to be back at the European Microfinance Week again this year. I'll be speaking a little bit from the perspective of the Global Impact Investing Network, or the GIN. And for those of you that may not be familiar with us, we are a nonprofit membership organization based in New York City, but serving impact investors globally, with the goal of increasing the scale and effectiveness of impact investing. And since our inception over 10 years ago, we've had a strong focus on impact measurement and management. And this includes building out IRIS Plus, which is a system for measuring, managing, and optimizing impact. But then moving even further to start to understand the impact performance and the impact results that are being achieved by impact investors in the market. And this is very much an evolving body of work. And one thing I'll share is a little bit more about the momentum that sits behind this. Cecile, if you could please advance to the next slide. We've been hearing extensive demand from the global market for greater insight into the impact results that are being achieved by impact investments. And this is coming from a number of sources. One is there's a lot of evolution in the regulatory environment, and we're seeing SFDR and other frameworks that are emerging that are really raising the bar on the standards of reporting and disclosures for funds that prefer to be described as impact funds. And part of what this means is that there's a need for a little bit more commonality in terms of how impact is being assessed and tracked and reported. We're also seeing a growing market. The number of impact investing organizations has grown tremendously, doubling in the last 5 years alone. And with this comes greater competition for capital, as well as for investment opportunity, and more complexity in a dynamic and fast evolving space. And so part of what that means is that there's a need to begin to differentiate one investment product from another, not only on the basis of the process of impact measurement, but also on the results that are being achieved. So this has led to a pretty sharp rise in appetite for impact data and analytics, all of which are really, really profound. And then the last trend I'll just point to is that there's global urgency that we really can't ignore. This past 2 years has made that especially noticeable, where inequality and inequity are pervasive. The job market is really challenging and delicate, and the effects of climate change are on full display. And so what this means is that there's a recognition that capital needs to be used effectively and efficiently, but also that outputs are no longer really sufficient to understanding if impact investments are creating real world changes for the people that need it most. And so what this has meant for the GIN is that we've been getting a lot of demand and calls to action to address some of this infrastructure gap. And I'll share a little bit more on the next slide about what we're doing to do that. We're in the early phases of a pilot impact performance benchmarking effort. And what this means is that we're building out two different types of analytic products. The first is an aggregate benchmark that would provide insight into the typical impact results that are being achieved by impact investments in the financial inclusion space. We're working closely with a small group of impact investors, including Triple Jump, which I know is also on the line today, to work together to build this out. And this will be a dynamic resource, so interactive filters and lenses, and I'll share a sneak peek of what that looks like in just a moment. The second product is some custom analytics, so a way to understand your own performance relative to this benchmark and to get an insight into how your portfolio has performed over time, some of the impact results that have been achieved and not achieved, and how this compares both to peer sets as well as to the broader social or environmental issue at hand. And specifically, we're thinking about the SDGs as a really critical barometer here. This work is currently under construction. It'll be launched publicly in the first half of next year, so we'll encourage you to stay tuned on that front. And maybe what I'll do now is share a sneak peek and show a little bit more detail on how some of these outcomes come into play directly into this benchmark resource. I'm going to share my screen and I'll show you an early prototype of the dashboard. One thing I'll acknowledge is that this is built from real data, but the data set is still pretty rapidly evolving, so the numbers are all subject to change. But it'll give you a sense of where we're headed. So we begin with an overview to get a better sense of the types of investments and the types of funds that are participating in this pilot benchmark. We've arrived at 7 key performance indicators, each of which is built from a combination of quantitative metrics, such as the number of active clients, as well as qualitative metrics, such as the features of a responsible financial service, to gain insight into different aspects of impact performance. These are also all backed by evidence of what works and what doesn't work, so largely academic or other quantitative and longitudinal studies. And they're also all aligned with the Impact Management Project's 5 dimensions, as well as IRIS+. We provide a little bit more detail into the funds that are represented, as well as the investments, before digging into some of the performance results. In our performance study, we look at each of these key performance indicators to gauge the typical performance, and in particular with a focus on the change that is occurring from one year to the next. This is showing us the average as well as the distribution. And as you'll see, we've got dynamic filters that allow a little bit of greater insight into the specific market segments that may be most relevant to you. And then the last sneak preview I'll share today is there's an additional layer to dig into for each KPI in particular. So this first KPI is looking at the number of active clients that are using responsible financial services, with some insight into the changes, the change required to achieve the sustainable development goals, the specific product features, and qualitative elements of that performance, as well as how this connects to the investor's contribution towards creating that impact. This is not meant to replace a lot of the current approaches to understanding impact, but rather to complement. There will always be a need for storytelling and anecdotes and the qualitative aspects of performance. But this is meant to help offer a little bit more detail and insight into the quantitative components of that impact performance as well, and to unpack the role that the investor in particular can play In no way does that diminish the really fundamental role that the investee also plays in creating real world impact, but rather just serving as a complementary layer. I'll stop my screen share there. It's, as I mentioned, just a work in progress at this stage, but one that we're really excited about. And we hope can provide more data that's actionable and useful, but also begin to put a little bit more heft behind the value of outcomes in addition to outputs measurement, particularly for investors. So with that, I will pass the torch back over and be happy to answer any questions as they come up.
Yes, thank you, Rachel, to give us the big picture and how the investors globally want to aggregate, benchmark, collect, analyze some data and some key output and outcomes indicators. Safeya, maybe you can continue and explain us a little bit how Tameo is working and supporting investors in outcomes measurement and management.
Thank you, Cecile, and thank you everyone for being here today. As Cecile said, I know it tends to be hard to focus in these virtual sessions, so we'll try to keep it brief and engaging for everyone. I wanted to start by introducing myself and introducing Tameo a little bit. So those of you who may have attended the European Microfinance Week before may have heard of Symbiotics, and I participated in these sessions on behalf of Symbiotics in the past. So I just wanted to briefly explain what the spin-off is and what our role is today and how we're hoping to support impact investors in their kind of process of impact management and outcomes measurement, specifically during this session. So we can go to the first slide, Cecile. So here I just wanted to quickly give an overview of Tameo. So we are a startup effectively that was launched in December last year as a spin-off of Symbiotics. And for anyone who's wondering why this spin-off happened, so within Symbiotics, many of you know, all the fund managers who might be in the audience today know that Symbiotics was running this annual microfinance investment vehicle survey, which today has been transformed into the Private Asset Impact Fund Survey, which we presented here at the European Microfinance Week yesterday. And we also had several kind of support services, not only for Symbiotics, but for the industry more broadly, like indices about the performance of microfinance vehicles and so on. So because these are functions that we're aiming to support the impact investing industry globally, there was a need to make sure that this type of research was independent and also more operationally efficient. And that's basically why Tameo was created. And what we do actually is that we take the expertise that we gained from working at Symbiotics, and we offer independent solutions to impact fund managers and to investors across the industry. With these services, our aim is to support more evidence-based decision-making and increase transparency in the impact investing industry. So this is like a very wide umbrella term, and what I'm going to focus on a bit today is talking about our impact solutions and zooming in on the outcome measurement specifically, drawing a bit on our experience of outcome measurement projects that we did with Symbiotics in the past and projects that we're doing right now. In terms of our impact solutions, as you can see here, we have 4 main services today. First of all, we support impact with impact reporting for funds. So there we're preparing annual impact reports using data that's collected by the fund managers. And we can tailor these reports based on the sectors of investment or any impact frameworks that are used by the fund manager. In addition to that, we work on outcome measurement projects where we're collecting data directly from the end beneficiaries of an investment. And that's what this session today is focused on. And I'll dive a bit deeper into that in a moment. But before that, I just wanted to share a bit more about our other services. So the first 2, the reports and the outcome measurement, are more hands-on. We're working more on the impact assessment and reporting. But then on the other hand, we also try to support investment managers to verify their impact management processes, So we offer verification services to assess any fund manager's alignment with the IFC principles for impact management. And we also this is kind of a work in progress today, but we're planning to launch an impact fund label as well. So this was kind of the overview. And then if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a bit more about our experience with outcome measurement. And I wanted to synthesize a bit what we've learned, and I've attended all these sessions over the past couple of days on outcome measurement, and of course I don't have like an answer for everyone, and we're learning as we go along from each other, but more or less what I wanted to share from our experience is we see that investors tend to measure end client outcomes when they already have a very strong impact management practice or IMM system integrated throughout their investment value chain. So we know, and all of us here who are working in the microfinance industry and the impact investing industry know that impact management is integrated from the very beginning, from prospection, from looking for a new investee, all the way to monitoring and feeding that back into the decision-making loop to decide on strategy and business plans moving forward. The outcome measurement portion comes when kind of everything else is put in place, and we have a good understanding of our impact and our outreach, and we're trying to understand really at a granular level how the end clients are being affected, and if we need to change accordingly something in our strategy based on that. And also, of course, there's a very strong component of accountability and transparency affiliated with that, as Cécile mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation. Now, some of the key considerations that we've seen when someone is deciding to move forward with outcome measurement is that as a company, or even as a social enterprise or as a financial service provider, there need to be very clear impact goals in order to be able to define relevant impact indicators or outcome indicators to collect from the end beneficiaries. And we've had a lot of interesting discussions, both in the past and even in the past 2 days, about how to determine what the relevant indicators are. So you always have this push and pull, I would say, between having quite standardized indicators throughout the industry to facilitate benchmarking. And of course, Rachel has already walked us a bit through that. And there are several ongoing initiatives to try to standardize the type of outcome indicators that are measured. But on the other hand, you have very specific business models and very specific funds and mandates with objectives that they want to assess, which may call for more tailoring of the indicators in several instances, especially because this is really the opportunity to do that, right? If you have an MIS where you're gathering data about every single beneficiary and you're doing a project to collect outcomes data specifically, this is where you have a chance to learn more. So you may choose to be including indicators that are a bit out of the norm, I would say. So there's definitely that component. Then the second thing that that's quite important is, of course, identifying the appropriate methodology and the sample size. So we've worked, I mean, in the past 5 years, I think we worked on. Now, can you still hear me? Yes? Okay. Sorry, I think it cut for a second. Yeah, so we worked on outcome measurement projects in 17 countries all around the world. I think we had 3 or 4 different projects. The last of them is running right now. And it's always been important to identify what's the most appropriate methodology and how to choose our sample. So I think in our experience, the optimal method for data collection that we found so far has been phone interviews. We have used face-to-face interviews in the past for a project that I talked about in the past and that we closed earlier this year. And there is a certain benefit that comes with that, primarily because you're able to collect information that you wouldn't be able to get on the phone or through an SMS, because you really have that one-on-one interaction with the client. They see that you can listen to them, they can share whatever they like. It's just a different dynamic, but of course the cost associated with that is quite high. And then the other component, again, like I said, is the sampling. So I think what's quite important when we're looking at outcomes measurement, especially as an investor, especially at a portfolio level, is trying to be representative. So one component that we always focus on quite strongly is selecting both countries and investees that are representative of a fund's portfolio or of an investor's portfolio. So there we're looking at representative in terms of the markets, and in terms of the how much of the fund's portfolio is allocated to those markets and to those investees. So it's quite unlikely that we would try to get an overall picture of outcomes at a fund level and go to an investee that has 1 or 2% of the overall portfolio, unless it's a super huge fund. So that's just one thing to be mindful of. And then sample size, I think usually you have a good kind of confidence interval for a sample size with a given institution. So I think to get a good sample, we try to get between 200 and 300 clients from one MFI. That I think tends to be a relatively good sample and is adequate enough in the majority of cases. So those are 2 points. I'm mindful of time, but another thing I wanted to mention is in order for an outcome measurement project to be successful, you need to have buy-in and funding from the investors. So actually from the investors and from the FSPs, but just so that I don't reiterate on that because it was already covered in the previous session, I'll focus on the investor side. But by and large, I would say that the investors need to be on board from the very beginning. So really early on, they need to see value in the outcome measurement, and they need to be supporting that. In most cases, historically at least, it's been support from public donors. Maybe Juan Luis can talk a bit about that after from the TA side as well. So a lot of the times funding for outcome measurement comes from public donors or from public-private partnerships. Though recently we've seen that more and more private investors are putting money into this, which is quite encouraging. And the way to get people on board is really to show them what they can do with the data. So that's really my last point. It should be quite clear from very early stages before you even collect the data what you want to do with it. So are you using it to monitor a specific indicator to see if you're headed in the right direction, or is it going to be used to define strategy later on? Is there one specific indicator that's super important to you? Maybe you need to focus on that and trim down on other indicators. Those are all considerations that we found have been quite instrumental for outcome measurement projects. And I think my last slide, I already covered most of the points, I feel, but we can go there already, and if there's anything else. So I was talking about the way forward. And here, as I already said, it's important to demonstrate the value across both sides of the value chain, so to investors and to the MFIs. So that they are supportive of the efforts. Standardization, we already mentioned, touched upon quite briefly. And then the last 2 points were about the data uses to see like if we need to adjust indicators as the products and practices evolve. So we've seen already over the past 10, 15 years that the type of indicators that are gathered change quite significantly. And so as the type of products that are offered by the MFIs change, we need to adjust the type of indicators that we collect. And then that feeds back into the loop of using the outcomes data for decision making. I know I was maybe a bit high level with the discussions. I didn't talk too much about specific projects, but we can circle back to that in the Q&A with you, Cecile, or with anyone from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Safia. It's in any case some of the lessons on core standards versus customized core standard indicators versus customized indicators. the channels to collect information, the sampling issues, and the decision-making process and the feedback loop, I think is a good insight for the investors. So Juan Luis, as an investor in the table, how do you work with those data and collection and analysis? I'll give you the floor. So up, yeah.
Thank you, Cecile. And don't worry, Safeya, I'll try to talk a little bit more in detail about projects so we complement each other very well. And thanks everybody for being here. As Cecile mentioned, I am TA manager for advisory services in TripleJump, supporting our financial service providers, investees. And I want to start mentioning or commenting on our perspective on why do we do what we do and measuring. TripleJump, as a management impact investment fund firm, aims to positively impact MSMEs, entrepreneurs' livelihood through funding we provide to these financial service providers. But we also aim to measure the outcome and the impact we intend to have with a twofold objective. The first one is for accountability and reporting to investors from whom our funding is originated. Sometimes, as Safeya mentioned, come from mandates from these first investors. And the second is to actively manage impact. This is to manage our funds taking impact as consideration. For instance, within financial inclusion space, we seek investment with the highest potential for impact, like helping underserved financial service providers or those that lack appropriate funding, but also to potential to create employment, or spaces where we can improve resilience, or some of our financial service providers also help people with disabilities, gender finance, or even biodiversity. We believe that an investor shouldn't push his own agenda on financial service providers, but first the investor has to know what impact wants to achieve. As Safeya just mentioned, has to have clear impact goals, and then very well select who he will partner with which financial institutions the investor will partner to achieve such intended outcome and impact. Through advisory services, TripleJump aims to help make effective change at financial service providers level that results on true measurable outcomes that contribute to our intended impact as investor on the final beneficiaries, being the micro, small, and medium enterprises. Specifically, we have launched 2 social outcome measurement initiatives to accomplish such purpose. I want to share with you a sneak peek on the next slide of these 2 initiatives. It might be a little bit different on origin, but at the end of the day, has kind of the same intended use of the data and application of this initiative. The first one is the Lean SOM, or the Lean Social Outcome Measurement. Within this project, we aim to use financial service providers' existing data and leverage on technology to understand clients by tracking social outcome changes over time and actively design products and services to improve social welfare. So far, we have delivered this initiative in Africa and Southeast Asia. The second initiative is a COVID-19 MSME impact measurement initiative that aims to support financial service providers and ultimately is MSME's clients to recover from the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. We have delivered this service in Latin America and Southeast Asia as well. One important aspect of this initiative is that because it's based on interviews to MSMEs, allow for qualitative data. Both initiatives have different sources of data, as you can see in this slide, on the middle of the slide, but has similar objectives, which is to understand the impact of MSMEs and how investors and financial service providers can help those MSMEs and the sector. And before anything, the most important part is for financial service providers, ask the question of why they are doing this, what they want to achieve with this. And with this, I want to go to the next slide to share with you a sample of indicators that we have collected in these initiatives. In the previous session, we already talked about the inputs, the activities, and the difference between outcome and impact. But within outcome, we can classify this in short-term outcomes, mid-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes. As you can see in the lower part of the slide, the short-term, the outcome, the stronger the sphere of influence of financial institution, and the longer the term, then the weaker this influence it is. For one of these specific projects, we selected, for instance, business development, change in disposable income and stability, and change in level of independence as categories of indicators. One thing that I want to mention, though, is that we shouldn't reinvent the wheel, but base the selection on existing indicators, such as the list of harmonized SPTF social outcome indicators or any other update set of outcomes. But we shouldn't change too much these indicators, because if we change too much, we risk not to make it comparable over time. Specific indicators that we have been using for these categories of indicators, for instance, in the short term for business development, we use change on business income or change on loan amount per term, also change on micro savings account. For employment, for instance, we have used change on number of employees or number of earning members in the family. For midterms outcomes, such as disposable income and stability, we have used specific indicators like change in purchasing power. For change in level of independence, we have used change in business ownership, home status, number of clients that go from group lending to individual loan. Or for financial stability, we have used indicators like payment delays. Sometimes we also have identified these long-term outcomes like improved living situation, but as mentioned initially, the sphere of influence of the control sort of saying of the institution is weak on this area. It's closer to impact. Maybe a bottom line is that the investor would work with institutions that aim for similar outcomes that the investor aim for and support such efforts. I want to go to the next slide to share you a sample of a dashboard that we have using. Okay, so here I just want to mention and also emphasize something that has been discussed in previous sessions. The first one is there is more than the level or the number of the baseline of an indicator. It's more important to understand the change of the indicator. Has gone up, has gone down, and then why, and then take actions over that. So analyzing 2 points in time is important. The other important point is to cluster and to segment, so we can understand what is happening with different group of people. And as Amelia mentioned in a previous session, you can segment by age, by location, by economic activity, and other criteria. And again, take action over those groups and differentiate those measures that you're going to take. And I'm going to show a sample later on this discussion. It is important to understand also when you have a finding, it's important to understand if the problem is an institutional problem or is a market failure, because that is going to have a lot to do with the type of measures that you're going to take as well. And I want to jump to the next slide to wrap up this first intervention to show you a sample of measures some financial service provider has taken. I think the most important part of this is, as I mentioned before, first, the institution needs to ask the question, why are we doing this? Why we want to accomplish? And then try to identify measures to solve those issues or to solve those problems, like to boost recovery of the MSMEs or the financial institutions, to strengthen resilience of the MSME clients, to better measure impact. And we can go to the next slide just to have a speak of the measures, or to attend risk management and restructuring issues or to support institutional strengthening. But again, these are just sample of some of the institutions we have helped with, but this measure has to be clear and tangible, and again, measurable to be sure that a change has been made. With this, I want to return the floor to you, Cecile, and thank you for the opportunity, and I'll be happy to answer questions by the end of the panel.
Yes, thank you very much, Juan Luis. I think it's very interesting also to discuss with Triple Gem the why. Why are you doing this? The role of existing data, also how you have used, and maybe we can discuss this a little bit further. And I think the segmentation that you do on the outcomes measurement also, and outcome indicators by sphere of influence of the FSP is also very useful to say, okay, is it actionable for the FSP, or is it really far from its sphere of influence and responsibility? And I think it comes back also to what is reasonable to measure as outcomes instead of trying to prove long-term impact, and which is not actionable and not in the sphere of influence of the FSP. And I think also the issue of changing over time is important, and comes back also to our discussion on core standard indicators. If we want to track over time, we need some basic standard indicators that we can collect on a regular basis. I think we all agree also, and that's part of the universal standards for social performance management, and the new version also on the segmentation and how we can do much more analysis with existing data or new data that has been collected, but segmented by type of clients, profile of clients, and type of products. So great to discuss with all of you. I see that there are maybe some questions. I'm sorry, I have to read at the same time, unless some of you have read the questions. Let's see, Ansram. It is an illusion that we can observe a linear evolution of the livelihoods of specific client groups, as natural, health, political disaster can strike at any time, and then livelihood situation can change drastically. And risk transfer mechanisms as insurance are always far too limited. So I think it's a general comment on what can be under the sphere of influence of the FSP or not. And I think it's a very interesting remark on what we have been discussing also on what should be short-term outcomes measurement that can be under the sphere of influence of the FSP, and what cannot be really reported neither in positive or in negative and attributed to the financial service provider. So I think those questions on what can be attributed. So maybe you want to comment on this, Juan Luis Afeya, and how can this could be tracked also at the overall level, what is really under the responsibility of the FSP and what is really beyond this. Any comments or suggestion on this?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to comment, since now we're kind of in the middle, or I hope not in the middle, but towards the end of the COVID pandemic, that of course there are always going to be natural kind of exogenous factors that affect the livelihoods of the end beneficiaries. If anything, the aim is to make sure when we're tracking outcomes or when we're tracking any kind of impact, that the FSPs, to the extent that they can, are supporting the end borrowers through these events, that in any way that they can. And if they're not able to support them, then at the very least that they would not increase the burden on them. And since I'm saying this because we did quite a lot of end client data collection during the pandemic, and that's we're doing a follow-up on that right now. So we see a lot of end clients talking about their experiences of how they were affected by such, it's not a natural disaster, but a pandemic, and how both from an institutional standpoint, the FSPs, as well as local regulation, has aimed to support the institutions through this and support the end borrowers through this. And when we track the outcomes, for example, just one thing, so we can move to other questions also, that we saw is that people were saying that they got support from the financial service providers during the pandemic. And this is a lot stronger now than it was 1 year ago, when a lot of people were actually not borrowing from FSPs, but turning to money lenders, which have quite exploitative practices. So seeing that evolution as an outcome indicator is definitely quite important for an investor to see, because it means that the microfinance industry is supporting the investors, the end borrowers, rather than them having to be subjected to the terms of money lenders as they were a year ago in the midst of the crisis. So there is improvement on that line. I don't know if that really addresses the comment so much. There's a lot of kind of facets to that we can't talk about, but just as an example.
Yeah, and to complement that, to elaborate on that, attribution is always the most difficult question. It's not new. It has been in the market for a long time. And I think that's why we're here. If it was easy, then we wouldn't be here. I mean, there are some, and that's why it's important that SPTF and the action groups are focusing also on this in the influence, or where the institution has more influence, like the short term or even the medium term goals. But we always with the eye on that there can be these exogenous factors that can move the needle to another direction. Sometimes where you invest, for instance, in housing funding, it's easier to understand the attribution because it's more directed on a segment or a niche. But often the funding to financial institutions is more broad. It's like working capital or lending working capital. Is very difficult to understand attribution. So so there's not a right question for this. But what we try to do is to provide to close to the investment advisor services on a specific items, on a specific topics or themes that align with financial institutions and investors' expectations, that can help increase the impact or the outcome on that specific theme of topic. It could be gender, it could be smart agriculture, energy, biodiversity, and try to have a greater attribution on those topics. But again, it's not an easy question to answer because there's always going to be other factors that affect this. And when you do outcome measurement, sometimes you don't get answers. Sometimes you get more questions, and you get the opportunity to investigate further and then get additional answers.
Thank you, Safeya and Juan Luis. I think, yeah, the question of alignment of expectations from the investors and the financial service provider is important. And maybe we can follow up with the question by Cassiope, Juan, and I think it will be linked also to what the GIN can expect at the higher level as data to be aggregated. Juan Luis, as an investor, I feel like everyone is trying to report indicators on end clients, whereas as investor, we first invest in financial service provider. I was wondering whether you report indicators on the FSP themselves, and if yes, which ones? And do you include it in your theory of change? So which level of information is collected and reported, and which one can you share with the GIN on the framework?
Yeah, well, not sure if I did follow correctly the question. I understand that besides indicators of the MSME clients, if we had indicators on the financial institutions, I guess like NPLs or loans, loan portfolios and productivity efficiency, I guess that's the question. If it is so, well, we do. I mean, in our due diligence and periodic reporting from the institutions, we always request information on some of the indicators, and we follow up to see how the financial institution is doing internally, financially, how is the health of financial institution, and sometimes that also help us to strengthen the financial institution, right? I'm not right now in the liberty to give a list of those indicators, but they are around, again, loan portfolio, NPLs, non-performing loans, efficiency, productivity, profitability, and so on, right? But yeah, we do. And together with the with the MSME, we try to have this impact on the sector. But again, as mentioned before, there's a lot of factors that also impact this. And there are some situations that are out of the control of the financial institution. Like in Nicaragua, there was a big no payment movement a couple of years ago, right? And then political unrest. And in Myanmar, with a group of that, also difficult situations. In Lebanon, with explosion and the country situation. So sometimes we need to take that into consideration. It's not sometimes if the financial institution is doing well, but under the circumstances, how well is doing the financial institution.
Yeah, and it's like Anstram was saying, it's also at the level of the financial service provider that they are subject to the local regulation or local crisis, and that can change a lot also what they can do. Rachel, maybe you can tell us what you managed to collect so far, and what is the way forward to get more outcomes, and which type of outcomes you think is reasonable for you at the aggregated level to collect.
I really appreciate this question because there's so much complexity that goes into establishing a theory of change and then gauging progress in that arena. And in the context of our pilot benchmark, we're looking in particular at two broader outcomes. The first is financial opportunity and resilience, and that's really focused on those end beneficiaries, the individuals and MSMEs that are receiving financing from the FSBs. The second outcome is looking at inclusive economic development. And one bit of background I'll share to how we landed there was feedback from the investors that we're working with, that they see their role exactly as you've described. It's jointly to improve the lives of vulnerable individuals, but also to support system building and market building, and some of that broader systems change. And so in that regard, growing strong companies that are quality employers, that are contributing to economic development and growth, that are contributing to stability, is also a really important part of that mandate. And so we have so far collected a pretty substantial amount of data that speaks to KPIs within each of those two outcomes, and hopefully can provide a little bit more insight into the progress that's being achieved there. The other piece I'll share is a lot of this is anchored on the theory of change, but also a lot of this is looking at the progress achieved relative to the scale of the solution required. And so across the board, we've been looking at how to compare impact results, not only among peer sets, but also to the corresponding sustainable development goal or science-based target, as the case may be, to really determine whether that progress is sufficient, if it's fast enough, if it's durable enough, and if it's lasting. And I share that because that's, of course, relevant to both of those outcome areas as well, but also relevant to positioning these results within a broader context. And we're mindful that context is crucial to interpreting impact performance across the board. And so one last thing I'll share on that front is in the realm of context, we've looked at these kind of external thresholds like the SDGs, as well as the context of the investment instrument, the timing, the stage of business when that capital is deployed, and the context of the investee, the type of organization, the market it's in, the nature of the individuals, the demographics that are being affected, all to paint this picture of both of those levels and types of outcomes. So I hope this provides a little bit more color into this. The reality is it's complicated, and any one investment can and should have multiple effects. And so that's where these different levels and layers can really come into play.
Yeah, and I think from what we heard also from the previous discussion on the financial service provider is also, yeah, on the short term outcomes, how the clients are using the products, which type of products, and yeah, how they are really integrating in the local context the different products that are provided. So and I think we had some discussion also on the previous calls on the trust on the data. So maybe Juan Luis or Safeya, can you tell us a little bit how you collect this data and how can you convince or how can the financial service provider be convinced of the quality of the data and to use the data? What is your tips a little bit to make sure those data can be trusted and used by the financial service provider and then aggregated at the portfolio level of the investors?
Yeah, I can have a go at it quickly. I think what's quite important is to also ask the FSPs before we start the data collection what indicators are of value to them, even if we are aiming to have a relatively standardized question set across multiple financial service providers. It's always important to reflect with the financial service providers before starting the data collection on those indicators and ensuring that if there are additional components that are really important to them, that we add those even as a separate module specifically for that FSP so that they feel that they are getting what they want out of the process. So that's something kind of before we start. Another component that's maybe important, but is not exactly what you were asking, Cecile, but I just wanted to raise that point, is when we're in a relationship with an FSP initially, it's important to talk to the right people so that when they're sharing a sample with us, they are always mindful of the fact that we need to have a random or representative sample of their client base so that then the results are informative for them. So if they pick and choose clients just to make it look good, then it's not in their interest and they're kind of losing the point of the exercise. So that's also one comment. And then on the feedback side at the end, it's definitely very, very important to share the FSP level results with each FSP and to try to have a conversation with them about what they learned from this process. So one thing that you shared in your initial slide and that we've seen in previous projects is that sometimes the FSPs, they kind of like say, okay, thanks, great. And they, save the file somewhere and never look at it again. And what's important is actually to try to initiate a dialogue with them, to present the results to them, because sometimes they don't make the effort to go through the results themselves. One thing that we found is not very helpful at all is just sending them an Excel file with the data and never talking about it again. So I think that's not a helpful approach at all. It's better to aggregate the FSP level results, explain it to them, and share that in addition to the raw data.
Data collection is the first step, data analysis the second, and then it's decision making, which is even longer step maybe. But yeah. Thank you, Safeya. And maybe to complete this and answer also to Thelma's question, Juan Luis, I'll add a question on the trust on the data, but also Thelma is asking, can you share your reflection on Yep, I don't see the question anymore because there is a new one. Or to what extent is the sector doing the studies and measuring social performance more from the accountability perspective and increased demand for transparency, harmonization, and not yet fully from the learning side or, I guess, decision-making process? So what is the driver for now on data collection? Okay, let's start with this. And
those are a very good question and somehow related. as well. And the last one, I'll explain a little bit on the culture, not only on financial providers, but on investors as well. But on that data collection, we use two ways to do this. We use data collected already by financial service providers and try to have that integrated in the systems, so they can push a button, sort of saying, and refresh the indicators that can help measure the social welfare or the change of livelihood of the MSMEs. Or we have also interview, or well, by supporting on third-party providers, interview MSMEs clients or financial service provider clients to ask questions. And as mentioned before, this allows us for more qualitative information when you interview people rather than using existing data. On how to convince financial institutions, well, first we need to ask them what they want to do, when they want to achieve, and then show them how they can achieve this using data, how they can, how the end result can benefit them to achieve what they want to achieve, right? And also sharing some cases, real cases, experiences, talking to other people that have done that is very useful. But one of the main issues is the commitment, the buy-in. And for this, we need, of course, the buy-in of the senior managers, the CEO, and other senior managers, but also we need to engage the final users from the start, so we can have their views on their needs and have them as active part of the design of this collection, of this initiative. About the culture, this is another important thing. Financial service providers are not used to make decisions based on data. Maybe a little bit on pricing, on risk, but mostly not on cluster segmentation, product service definition, or redesigning, and others. And the same with investors. Sometimes, and to answer the other question, we are most inclined to use data to reporting and not necessarily to make decisions on, again, what sector we're going to fund or impact, what products or services that financial institution need to change or to improve. And this is a cultural thing that we need to start changing and use more data to take decisions. Personal relations are very important, and we should never take that off the table of financial institutions, but we need to base our decision more in data. And also another challenge is the capacity to understand and use of the data and dashboard, because it's not something that we use on a daily basis. We don't have the capacity or the competencies to do that on a good way. So we also need to work on that. And finally, I just want to add another challenge. I want to emphasize this because it has been talked one and again, is the lack of quality of the data and the integrity of the data. And even sometimes when you want to compare different institutions, you can have uneven quality of data. So that makes even a little more difficult to aggregate and compare it. We need to do that, but we need to find ways to work on this lack of quality, on uneven quality of the data. And it was also mentioned by Yamini in the previous session, and Scott on the financial service provider's perspective, and so on. So it's important to take a look at that as well.
Yeah. So I think we are going to the end of the session. We have a question by Davide Castellani also on how to measure the upturns and the downturns, not just the positive side, but also the negative changes. Maybe we don't have time to really report on all these, but I think it's a key point also. And also for comparing different FSP in the same country, having some, not just the positive, but also the negative. I think it's something which is raised also on the new standards developed by the Social Performance Task Force on how to understand the unintended consequences and negative consequences. So I think this is entirely part of the outcomes measurement and management process also. More difficult maybe to report at the global level, but at least it could help for decision making. Also, it's a very insightful element for decision making. So yes, let's also not forget that outcomes measurement is also measuring the negative side. And yeah, very interesting point, Juan Luis, to maybe we have still to change the culture to have data-driven decision making and not just finger launch decision making, but how to make sure that data is used, and maybe the more we will use data for decision making, the more the FSP will see also the value of high quality data. We have seen this in some cases where they have improved their MIS and trained the field staff to collect better client data because they saw the value of collecting the data to take informed decision and not just to report to the investor. So aligning investor and FSP perspective also on the decision making can be a great push to change the culture and improve outcomes management and measurement. You have a final word maybe to share to close the session, the three of you. I don't want to be the last to talk. A final tips to improve, and next year we have plenty of good outcomes data to take informed decision. Safeya, you want to share a word?
No, I mean, right now we're working on one COVID study that will close, and then we're going to do another study on financial inclusion next year. So looking forward to sharing the results next year, and hopefully taking some of the lessons we learned from these discussions, which were really very rich. And I just want to thank everyone for their participation and their comments, and for sharing all their lessons learned.
Rachel, you want to?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I think one thing it reminds me of that is just so valuable is that different data points serve different purposes. And not every data point can answer every question. And so there's just a really rich opportunity, I think, for both the standardization, but also the nuance that's come up throughout today's discussion, and thinking about what's benchmarkable and what's not, what's useful to gauge progress over time, and what might not be, and building in some of that kind of nuance to the conversation. And so that for me is a really clear takeaway from this. And yes, as Safeya said, just a huge thank you to you, Cecile, Safeya, and Juan Luis. It's always a pleasure, and to everyone on the line, it's really a treat to be able to connect.
Thank you, Rachel. Juan Luis, the last word.
Yeah, I think my last word would be don't measure just for the sake of measuring, but make sense out of it. And everything that you do on measuring has to accomplish something. And so find out what you want to accomplish and have that tangible results. And with that, again, thank you everybody for being here. Thanks, Cecile, Safeya, Rachel, always very insightful to discuss with you, and I'm glad to be here this time.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the participants for the discussion, and yeah, looking forward to exchanging. e-MFP will publish the brief on outcomes measurement and the SDG, and we can continue to work on the culture of data-driven management. Thank you, everybody. I think there is a session on regulation and outcomes tomorrow also, so we can continue and have our families and cats and all around us sharing all these insightful discussions. Have a good day, and talk to each of you. And next year we will have a coffee after this session.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Sounds like
Bye,
a plan.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.